Serious, what's your true supernatural/unexplainable, downright creepy story? When I was in 5th grade, I was walking to the bus and it was just breaking dawn. I had to walk about a half mile down a back road with woods lining either side. About halfway down I was surrounded by about 8 or 9 dogs, not wolves, but like actual different breeds of domestic dogs. They didn't make a noise but they blocked my path in a half circle. I was terrified and ran back home, and when I looked back they were gone. When I think back on it, I hope maybe they were protecting me from an unknown danger down the road that morning. Who knows? We had a computer room in our house that was at the end of a hallway. So I went down the hall to use the bathroom and I could see the glow from the computer screen dimly lighting up the room. Then it looked like someone walked in front of it, and cast a shadow on the wall. I jumped and then started laughing. "Geez, you scared me." I look in and there's no one in the room. I booked it out of there and avoided that bathroom for weeks. My colleague used to work in a hospital and would often receive phone calls around 3 a.m., but no one would speak at the other end of the receiver. The number was from an extension somewhere in the hospital, and when they looked it up, it was from an old morgue nobody has used in a while. My family moved to this standard upscale suburban home after roughing it for a couple of years to save up. We also got a deal on the home, because it was a model home before it was ours, like had all the fake furniture to show off the neighborhood homes. Anyways, it had this loft area with 2 stairwells that go up to it, one in the front and one in the back. You could pretty much hear everything from this loft since it was so open. One day my 2 best friends, guy and a girl, are hanging out in the loft. We were in HS, and they were horny and always all over each other, whether I was in the room or not. We were watching TV and I get up to take a piss. When I left, they were all up on each other. When I came back, they were on different ends of the couch. I just had they had gotten into a fight, so I asked what was up. "Your little sister is home," the dude says. My face turned sheet white. "What's wrong?" the girl asked. I asked them what made them think that. They said they heard her. I am sort of freaking out at this point. "No one's here," I say. "We checked the house, and I'm right." Well, it turns out that before it was a model home, a family lived there and a little girl had been playing in the loft, but had climbed on the railing and fell to her death below. My 2 best friends swear, to this day, that they heard what they thought was my sister laugh and run up the stairs, hitting her hands on each step like she was running up on all fours. I never had any encounters, other than the fact that right next to where she landed was the house's central intercom. We had an intercom system in every room that you could play music through, or talk to each other. Every so often at night at the same time you'd wake up to the intercom button being pressed, and just the blank sound of static airways like someone was holding down the button but no one was speaking. My room was on the 3rd floor, and I'd have to walk down to the bottom to the main unit and turn it off there. I always thought I'd see her. When I was a baby we lived in a big old manor house with my grandparents. One day, my dad woke up in the middle of the night to see what looked like a ghost of my mum on top of the bed screaming, and trying to get into my mum's sleeping body. It freaked him out so much, that he refused to ever go back to the house and we moved out. When I was about 6 we had moved out and had our own apartment. One morning just after we woke up my mum went to make a warm cup of milk for both of us. It was winter, and the lights were off in the room but were on in the corridor. I can remember vividly seeing the dust come together, and a ghost in the form of my mum but dressed like sure was from the 1800s came together, and walked out of the room following after my mum and not acknowledging me in any way. It was the most surreal thing that I've ever seen, and I still vividly remember it. I was invited to a sleepover at my friend's house when I was 9 or 10. It was in a crummy, crime-ridden part of town, and I was already apprehensive about the whole thing. Turns out my friend planned for us to sleep in tents outside in the backyard. We go to sleep and I unexpectedly wake up in the middle of the night. All my friends are gone from the tent. Freezing cold and absolutely terrified, I look around the yard and eventually enter the house. None of the doors are locked and for the life of me I can't find a living soul. I'm practically all alone, scared less in my pajamas. I find a phone and call my mom. About 15 minutes later she picks me up and takes me home. Later I found out that my friends had moved to a different tent in the yard without telling me. In my panic during the night, I thought they had all disappeared. Not really supernatural, but in the moment it was the most horrifying, inexplicable thing I ever had the displeasure to experience in my childhood. My grandmother, who died before either my sister or I were born, was a huge Scrabble player, and actually won a regional Scrabble championship for the Midwest United States. When my sister was very young my parents got out my grandma's old Scrabble set to show her how to play, even though she was too young to spell anything over 3 or 4 letters. The game Scrabble starts by each player pulling 7 tiles from the bag. My sister, who I will remind you was very young at the time, pulls out 7 tiles and says, "What does EILOARS spell?" My parents look at the letters and realize that my sister Rosalie, who was named after my grandma Rosalie, pulled her exact 7-letter name from my grandma's Scrabble set. I'm home alone one day. It wasn't dark or spooky or raining or anything. It was the middle of the day and I had just gotten home from work. Now, with the door open when I'm home alone, since why the F not? I'm doing my business and browsing Reddit as per tradition when I hear my laundry room door open and slam closed. Odd, it's only 2 p.m. and my parents don't get home from work until at least 4. My sister was at school but maybe she left early. I yell hello and reach over and close the door, so that whoever is home doesn't have to see me hissing. I hear some footsteps walk into the living room then just stop. I yell again but no response. My dad listens to audiobooks a lot on his phone, so I figured he walked in with earbuds in and didn't hear me. I finish my business up and walk out to see who was home and no one was there. I kept yelling around the house but there was no answer. I walked outside and it was just my car in the driveway. I started to panic a little bit since my laundry room door is quite heavy and is very loud when it closes, so there was no way I misheard something. I searched the whole house, looked outside on the patio, side yards etc. Nothing. No one was there. I then got this huge feeling of fear and bolted back inside and just sat on the living room couch waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened. No noises, no sounds, no doors opening. Nothing. I eventually got up and went back to my room and never heard anything again. It would have scared the shit out of me had I not taken care of that problem beforehand. I guess it's not incredibly scary or anything, but it is weird. When I was about 12, our family moved into a new house, new to us, actually quite old. It was in our same village but down a different lane. Part of it used to be a bungalow, so my room and my sister's room were on the ground floor, down a long hallway. All of the ground floor had walnut flooring, and there was a Persian rug outside the door to my room to avoid cold toesies in the morning. Every night, around 11 or so, I would hear footsteps walking at a fairly slow pace right down the hall, from the end guest suite up past our rooms and away down the hall to the living room. I was always in bed when I heard them, and so was everyone else. You know how you can tell who a family member is by the way they walk up the stairs, or open a specific door? I knew it wasn't anyone in my family. Plus, it was the sound of outdoor shoes clacking on the wood and everyone in my family wore slippers inside the house. I would hear the footsteps start, fairly loud on the wooden floor, way down the hall, come up past my sister's room, and then there would be a pause, while whatever it was walked over the rug. You could hear the gap in the footsteps, about 3 seconds, then they would start again on the other side of the rug, and fade out as they walked down the hall away to the living room. Then they would come back, same footsteps, break across the rug, resumed on the other side. I don't remember ever feeling scared, but I never ever went out to see what it was. I would fall asleep to the sound. It would go on for a really long time. It stopped about 3 or 4 weeks after we moved in and I never heard it again. I didn't really think about it much after it stopped, but I've never forgotten it, and as an adult it makes me shiver to remember it. Creepy depends on your perspective about it, but lost time. My brother was helping me across the country. We borrowed a van and loaded everything up for the last trip. Just before we left I checked my watch and called my GF that we would be hitting the road soon. My brother checked the kitchen clock but only told me later he did. We set out but couldn't do more than 80 kilometers per hour because of the load. When we took the off-ramp of my new city, my brother told me he couldn't remember the trip. When I thought about it, neither could I. We both thought we were tired and thought nothing of it. However, when we arrived at my new house my GF asked if I broke the speed limit, because we were almost an hour early. When retracing the route, my brother and I both agreed that we can remember passing a certain gas station and nothing thereafter, until the off-ramp. To this day we have no clue what happened during that hour we're missing, or how we could have traveled that fast. Not with any car or van at least. Now at the beginning, I wrote we both independently checked for time. This is important for us because one time source could have been wrong but not both. Also I called before we left, which limits the time we could use to travel. Since then we have never experienced any weirdness like it or otherwise. I don't have any weird memories or dreams, no pieces of metal lodged under my skin, etc. Just an hour I lost. I don't think it's supernatural, but it was creepy. My mother died suddenly 3 years ago, 8 days before the birth of my son. There's a picture on the wall of my house of her and he knows it's grandma. My dad is still in that house but we have never visited. partly because I have a mental hang-up about going back there and partly because of the logistics. It's an overnight ferry. Dad visits us often and I will go back there soon. Anyway, my son has never seen the house and I've never shown him photos of it. He hasn't been to the village, the area or even the country, France. I was showing him Google Maps last week and the thing you do with your phone or tablet where, if you move the device, the field of view moves with you. So I'm showing him our house, his other grandmother's house, his school etc. and he gets it and has a play. My dad lives in rural France so the Google car hasn't done a pass of his street to my knowledge. I decide to check and it's just been done so I drop the pin and open it up. The view opens with the house over the street so I start to move it and my boy shouts grandma's house. A bit taken aback I ask how did you know that? Because it was bit eerie so I ask him to point at the window, and say which one is the kitchen and he puts his finger on it straight away. Which room does daddy sleep in? Again the finger on it straight away. Which one is grandma's? He points to it and says it was that one. Loads of rational explanations etc. but it creeped me out. When I was in high school my uncle would throw me a couple bucks to help babysit his kids with my aunt. They lived in a 2-story house by the water, nice area. The kids were about 3 and 6, respectively. One day I was sitting in their den on my phone when I started to hear a baby crying. Thinking it was the 3-year-old, I headed to the bottom of the stairs to check and see if my aunt was up there dealing with it. I called for her a couple times with no response. The baby kept crying. I called for her one more time, and when I got no response I started walking up the stairs. Then I heard my cousins and aunt playing outside. All the hairs on my body stood up and I literally felt a chill run down my spine. I quietly turned around, walked down the stairs, got in my car and drove away. The baby was still crying when I closed the door behind me. A few years later I was drunk at a family party and told my uncle the story. He told me that he and his wife used to hear the baby too, and apparently the previous owners had a kid die of SIDS in that room upstairs. He's uber Catholic and had a mass said for the baby. He said after that it never happened again. Still gives me the willies when I talk about it though. Last year I was staying in a hotel with my mom. One of the nights as I was laying in bed I noticed a human silhouette maybe 2 meters away from me. I figured it was just a shadow so I tried to ignore it but I couldn't. I turned the light on and obviously it disappeared, but when I shut off the lights again it came back. I tried to convince myself that it was just a shadow, but trust me when I say there was nothing in that room that could have made a shadow like that. I looked around the room several times. It also occurred to me that the shadow weren't there the previous nights, and nothing had been moved around. It looked just like a human silhouette. I never believed in ghosts, but right then and there I was terrified. I was too scared to look at it so I turned around and eventually fell asleep. I told my mom about it the next morning and she just shrugged it off. She said I was just imagining things. Fair enough. That shadow weren't there the next night? Or the next? A few days after we had gotten back home my mom was doing something in the kitchen and I was just sitting there studying. Without turning around my mom said, "Do you remember that shadow of a person you saw at the hotel?" I said yeah. My mom just said I saw it too. My blood turned to F-king ice. Mom didn't want to admit that she also saw it. I thought that she was sleeping, because she didn't want to freak me out. I'm convinced that if ghosts exist, I saw one that night. My mom thinks it was the ghost of her best friend, who had committed suicide just a few days prior. Mom had spent hours earlier that evening writing her a long letter for some kind of closure. Maybe her best friend also wanted to say goodbye. Growing up, our house was very haunted and even though it's not as active today, I still get creeps sometimes when I go home to visit. A few years before I was born, my great-grandmother died in what would become my bedroom, her sitting/TV room, and my parents and I both remember walking into that room and very clearly smelling rose-scented perfume, like somebody had dumped a bottle of it on the carpet. According to my parents it was the same kind she wore almost daily up until she died. I've seen apparitions in that house as a child/teenager. My grandfather, mom's side, died when my mom was 3, 1950s, so I've never met the man, but I remember being in the kitchen one day and seeing a man in a brown suit with a skinny black tie stand in the entryway and look at me, then vanish. I recognized him immediately from family photos. It was my grandfather. I've seen blue lights/orbs during the day in different rooms, felt cold spots, been touched by invisible hands, heard footsteps when I was home alone, and even had drawers/cupboards open spontaneously in front of me. Nothing was ever scary per se, but a lot happened that was certainly unnerving. I have more stories if you guys are interested. My friend had died twice due to being struck in an intersection during his teen years. 5 years later we were having a conversation about the supernatural and I had said, "You know, it's funny, we can be sitting in a room full of people." His eyes darted back and forth around the room, and began to do this weird tears without emotion thing that he had started doing since the accident. He blamed it on damage to the brain, but about a minute after my comment, he told me to leave. Edit. By far the most supernatural feeling I've felt was when me and him were on our way to his place around 11 p.m. It was a full moon and he was telling to watch this and pointed to the moon. We had already been discussing the moon and how bright it is. When within the matter of 10 seconds clouds cover across exactly half the moon, the most insane straight line of clouds, and says that's better.